My name is Anthonie De Hoog. I was born in The Hague, the Netherlands in 1944, and I came to Canada in 1957 with my parents.
So being born in the Netherlands, you were born in 44, and the war ended in spring of 45.
Correct.
Do you have, and this you probably don't, but do you remember anything from that period?
I was obviously too young because I
you
would
were
have
too
only
young.
been 3 months old in
Yes.
December, and in January
You
1945 I was 4 months.
You weren't even a year old when the war ended.
Although I do remember one story that my parents told me during my babyhood that the war at that point was pretty bad in Holland because of the food shortages and
Yeah,
so
the
that's what they call
winter,
the
right?
hungry winter,
Yeah.
or as I say in Dutch, hunger winter.
Yeah, hunger winter.
And I remember my parents chiding me about being this baby that kicked his food dish out, and here they had been struggling all day long to try and find some food, and there it is laying on the floor. So that's one of the
Right.
memories I do remember from not personally, but that's
No,
what
but
I
that's
was
a
reminded
story.
of. Yeah.
Whether any stories were passed down, not so much about the famine, we'll get to that in a bit, but about the initial invasion. You mentioned your father was involved. He was a grenadier.
Yeah, my father was in the reserves because you have to remember that Holland at that point was still a neutral and had been neutral during the First World War. So the standing army was pretty minimal, and he was mostly a part-time soldier that was mobilized when the war clouds started to gather over that part of the world. Yes.
Right.
And then he participated in the Battle of the Heberberg, which is now the National War Memorial Site, which was the main invasion entry by the Germans into the Netherlands. And from history, you'll know that the soldiers were told that after about 3 days, and that was because of the threats by the Nazis that they were going to bomb every one of the cities like you see now in the Ukraine. But in Holland, they were threatened with flattening of Rotterdam, so then the Dutch government capitulated and essentially told the soldiers, you're all done, you might as well go home. And that's what happened. So my father's platoon suddenly disbanded.
So did they ever talk much about the occupation itself?
They did talk about it, and my father and my mother met in 1942, and they were married in January of 1944.
Right.
One interesting little story is that my parents, or my father, before he was married even, he had his apartment, which had what we call a front room and a back room, and between the two rooms was a set of sliding doors that were like pocket doors. And he had built himself a hiding place because what was happening during those years, the Germans were fond of what they call a razzia in Dutch, where they would literally block off a central area of the city or a part of because it was all apartment buildings, and they'd block off a certain area, and then they'd go house to house looking for able-bodied men, like my father, who was at that point about 33, 34, and they would then put them on transports to Germany, and they became forced labor in the German factories. Right. So he had made himself a hiding place, and then he would, of course by word of mouth, because there was no telephones or anything like that.
Yeah.
They would hear that there was going to be a razzia happening, and then they'd all go into hiding, which is kind of peculiar because as soon as that was over, then he could actually go back to work.
Right. It was just whenever they were out, like you said.
Yeah, but so then he survived that way. One of my dad's acquaintances was taken, and he didn't come back until after the war was over in 1945, and it was only a couple of years later that he killed himself.
Really?
Because of, so it was no picnic just because you didn't have to go to a concentration camp. You were still living in some sort of camp, and working for the Germans was no picnic, I don't believe. And then he met my mother in 1942 through a colleague of his from the platoon who lived in the southern part of Holland, in a place called Zeeland.
Right.
and he stayed friendly with him, and this was how he managed to get a bit of food smuggled in periodically, and my mother would be the delivery person.
Okay. And so that's how the relationship sort of came
that started,
about. Fell in love with the delivery girl.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah, I guess you could put it that way.
No, it's sort of what happened, though, isn't it?
Now, my mother, after they were married, in this hunger winter, they were, marginal rations. So she would spend basically all day on a bicycle going around the countryside looking to see if she could beg, borrow, or pay, however they got it, food. And on more than one occasion, she was stopped by a German soldier who had nothing as well. And they would steal all the food, so she'd come back after full days of scrounging and had nothing. So it was pretty bad. And if you've looked at any pictures, you'll see photographs of Amsterdam or The Hague, where they lived, of children or people laying on the side of the street, just literally laying on the side of the street. They couldn't go any further because they just didn't have any more energy.
That was miserable.
Oh, terrible. Yeah.
Really awful.
Yeah.
And so it was sort of, I suppose, from my knowledge, that the famine, the hunger winter, as you put it, was sort of alleviated by the arrival of the Allies. Specifically, the Canadians were in large part who liberated the Netherlands.
Now, my dad did mention in passing the site of the bombers coming across from England with the food drops.
Right.
And then all the people had to be warned because they'd been so used to minimal rations that they could overdo it on chocolate bars, and those people actually died.
Yeah, you'd overeat.
Exactly. And he did paint a picture of, I can visualize it coming over Scheveningen, which is part of The Hague. He described these bombers, in which now you see one plane, you say there's one plane, but this was like dozens of aircraft, all kind of basically just far enough apart, and all this stuff was being dropped into the populace.
Right. So that was one method of relief, I suppose.
Oh yeah.
Just sort of humanitarian bombing runs from Britain. But they dropped food instead of.
Now, my father was a printer. He worked for a printing company, and he was a participant in the resistance movement. He was quite a pacifist, so he did not. At the end of the war, there was quite a violence against the NSB'ers, which is the Landverraders, which we call them, that were in cahoots with the Germans.
Collaborators.
He was not one to be part of hangings, because they used to hang them off the lampposts. And they used to take the women and cut their hair off and tar and feather them. That was not his scene. So he participated in a more moderate way by either carrying food coupons to certain locations where they were used by the Allied soldiers that were landing by, if their planes were bombed down. And so they would provide the families that would put these people up with extra coupons, because they didn't have hardly enough to themselves. So he participated in distribution of food. Now, these are mostly bogus, of course, but they were still usable, and that's how they helped in the resistance movement, or he did anyway.
So you would have grown up. Your early childhood was spent in the Netherlands. In The Hague, right?
That's right.
And so what was it like to grow up in post-war Netherlands, right?
Well, it was pretty grim, there were still a lot of remnants of the German invasion, like bunkers and things like this. And I remember my dad taking us for a walk in the countryside, not far from where he lived. And that was a German launch site for the V-1 bombs, those rockets. Now, as a kid, I used to spend my summers on my mother's sister's farm in Zeeland. So that was just like any other place. I mean, they didn't suffer in that particular area. They didn't suffer as much. Further south, then they had all the polders that were flooded. Canadians that fought from Antwerp into the south of Holland, south of the Netherlands. But I didn't recall very much influence on my thinking I remember seeing these bunkers on strategic spots on the roads were still there, and on the beaches you could still see all these invasion bunkers that the Germans had built for the defense of Europe from the invasion. And
Yes.
but we knew what they were. We used to, as kids, play in them.
Yeah. Well, the memory would have still been quite fresh.
Yeah.
Right? It wasn't that far off.
Yeah.
It wasn't like nowadays where it's very distant. Would have been less than 10 years before.
Oh yeah, yeah. But when your parents don't spend too much time talking about it with each other, as a impressionable child, I don't think
No, you wouldn't. You wouldn't pick up on it.
I wouldn't pick up on that too much. No. But my childhood, I must admit, was really quite normal.
Yeah, no. It sounds it, right?
Yeah.
Besides, playing in German bunkers and things like that. But yeah, so you mentioned you came to Canada. Was it in the late 1950s? You said
1957.
57.
1956, my father started the process of immigrating to Canada, and he was already with a family of 5, so it took him quite a while to be accepted.
Yeah.
And he actually had already a job secured with a newspaper in Brandon, Manitoba, the Brandon Sun, which still exists to this day. And we flew into Montreal on a Saturday. He was working at the Brandon Sun on a Tuesday, so that was pretty good going.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
What prompted him to leave the Netherlands and I guess further, what prompted him to choose Canada?
Well, Canada was the country that was the first to accept him because he had also applied for moving to South Africa and Australia and New Zealand, but because of his size family, they were more interested in smaller families. So Canada did accept him. And then also having already secured a job before he even got settled into a house helped as well. But then there was a very big Dutch movement in Winnipeg that looked after immigrants, because those are the years when the immigrants from 1952 to 57 was the big influx of Dutch people moving to Canada. Right. The Winters that live here in Sussex, for example, were
exactly.
I think John de Winter came at about 18, at the age of 18 in around 52. Mm-hmm. So he was always interested in that, and he also had a sister-in-law. My mother's sister lived in Brandon, who were also instrumental in saying, "Hey, why don't you come to Canada? It's great here," type thing. So that's how that all came about.
So you had a good deal of help then.
Well, the government subsidized the move.
Yeah, right. The Dutch government or the...
If you were taking the ships, which would land in Pier 21, the government would pay for that. But my dad needed to shorten that up from a 10-day ocean voyage. He needed to be here faster because of this job. So then he used that subsidy money, paid it toward the airline. So then KLM was the airline we came on.
Right, the Royal Dutch Airlines.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, so it was sort of the grim post-war situation that prompted your father and your mother to move with you to Canada then, or to just leave the Netherlands?
No. This had something to do with the fact that things looked so grim that he felt that if he was going to do anything for his family to better themselves, that's why he chose to emigrate.
I see.
So he was kind of an adventurous because he was 46 by the time he came to Canada. So I don't think I'd have the guts to a family with 6 kids if you didn't have to.
That's quite a
and moved into the Maritime. So my mother had quite a hard time adjusting as an immigrant mother. All of a sudden, within a year, her kiddies were all speaking English.
Yeah.
And she, still being a stay-at-home mom, had no access to learning English. So she took that pretty hard. That all of a sudden we were communicating in a language she couldn't understand.
Yeah, it'd be very difficult.
Oh, it was.
Wouldn't it?
Yeah.
So Manitoba. The only reason your father decided to take his family to Manitoba was the job he had lined up, right? Or was he already looking at Western Canada more generally because that was where the immigrants were settling?
No, this all had to do with the fact that his sister-in-law and her husband were there.
Okay.
So that they immediately had familial contact, and they are the ones that kind of put him in touch with this newspaper to apply for the job.
Okay, so what I'm getting from this is a lot of A lot of it has to do with just the pre-existing Dutch community there. People who had already moved and were helping the new arrivals to sort of land on their feet, as you said. So they would have helped them find a job. They would have helped them through the process of buying property and all that stuff. So yeah, I suppose that's just a lot of the impression I get is a lot of the place you settled, the way that you settled. It seems to have been influenced by like the welcoming committee, all that.
Absolutely correct. I had it been my aunt and uncle living in Brandon, they could have easily lived in Ontario, or they could have easily lived in British Columbia. This just happened to be where they were, so that's how we ended up in Brandon. We arrived in Brandon, Manitoba at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon in August the 7th, I think it was August 7th or August 9th, no 7th. And all I remember is that this heat, we came off the train and it had the CP rail already had air-conditioned coaches then. And I remember getting off the train, and there was a welcoming committee there to greet us, and the heat, because we were not used to that kind of heat.
No.
You know, this was like 30-degree heat, and the open space. And the first thing my dad bought was he went to a store called Safeway, which is now part of Sobeys, and he bought a carton of cigarettes because they were like $2 or $3, and in Holland you're buying the cigarettes by the single cigarette. And I remember him, I got this carton of cigarettes, and that kind of stands out in my mind.
Right.
And then the shops, or actually the Safeway in Brandon, compared to the little stores that you would see in Holland, you know, these little community stores, the open store and all the goods that were on sale there. That's what I remember.
It would have seemed like a land of plenty, right?
Absolutely.
But it seems to have worked out quite well for you then.
It worked out very well. All my siblings have all ended up becoming very good taxpayers in Canada. we all got our jobs as soon as we. I went the community college route. My brother became a Rhodes Scholar. So
really.
So yeah, we did okay. My dad was quite proud of his family, which is ultimately the reason why he did this.
He seems to have achieved his goal of bettering his family, right?
I would think so.
Really made something.
Yes.
Which is, I think it's nice.
Yeah.
Nice success story, isn't it? What would you like to say further, as a man who was born in the Netherlands at the tail end of the war, moved to Canada, has lived here most of his life? Sort of what thoughts would you like to share to tie this all together? My
main thoughts are due to the fact that once in a while I go back to Holland. You know, with the high density population there, when I come back across the ocean and we see the country unfolding as we come across the ocean, let's say the 747, and you see the greenery of Newfoundland, you say, you know, you don't have the density of population, so you have the freedom to move around and basically just you know, to do anything you want to do. And in our case, as I say, I took the community college route. The other ones went to university, and we integrated completely. And the Dutch actually completely integrate. You know, you have the hard time keeping a handle on your language. Like the only people that I can talk Dutch to is the Winters.
Yeah, Dutch is quite similar to English. When
well,
you come down to it.
You know, like the population in Holland is mostly totally bilingual in English Dutch.
Well, you're right across the channel.
That's right, and the Germans are the same. I think they just integrate totally into the fabric of the country here, and we just become Canadians.
Yes. And you're very good Canadians at that.
Yeah, and I can show my passport, which is important.
Right. Mr. De Hoog, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me.